Emil Malizia, FAICP, is a professor at the University of North Carolina and has been for quite some time. He currently directs the Institute for Economic Development at UNC. And he's written several books, including Understanding Local Economic Development and more than 150 other publications. And in addition to his academic work, Professor Malizia has served as a consultant to private developers as well as nonprofit development and public agencies. I first got to know Emil back at Cornell, where I was a student. Emil was a couple of years ahead of me, so he became somewhat of a mentor to me when I started my planning work there, and I've always had enormous respect for him, his work, and the leadership both here in the state, but also the leadership in the planning community really worldwide. So, Emil, we look forward to your comments here this evening, and you are our first speaker.
When I began studying city planning as an undergraduate 50 years ago, there were great debates that had begun about cities and planning. The Death and Life of Great American Cities had been published a couple of years before. Jane Jacobs was attacking grand civic design, town planning, the tradition that stemmed from Daniel Burnham down to Robert Moses, I guess her nemesis. So if we fast forward 50 years, look at the bewildering array of threats and problems that we're trying to deal with. So it's very timely that APA is calling on us to try to come up with some big ideas to address these things. And tonight, I'm going to talk about relevance, economic development, and finance, actually in that order. So let's get going. This is something from a recent issue of the other major publication that the American Planning Association supports, Journal of Planning, Education, and Research, that lists guiding principles. And what I find interesting about this is that there really is only one that I think is a basic guiding principle. And maybe, if we do nothing else tonight, we can revisit what I think are three big ideas about planning. These basic principles that have to do with focusing on the future, applying holistic thinking to places, and promoting the public interest. And on the basis of these principles, we do future-oriented, comprehensive, public interest-oriented city and regional planning. So maybe I can stop there. But let's come back to the cover. One of the other things I see is that most of these things, most of these guiding principles, are really about process. And only the last two, economic development and education, are about substance. I think there's been too much process in planning, too much process-oriented. And big ideas, I believe, are more about substance. Mitchell Silver has asked, what does the P in planning stand for? Maybe you've heard him ask this question. Hopefully you know the right answer. It's planning, it's not process. And, do you remember the late George Carlin? What he had to say about process?
We're about to begin the boarding process. Process. Completely useless word. We're about to get on this beep airplane.
I wish he were alive. So what about regaining our purpose? Well, here's something that you've all seen. The purpose of planning: increase livability and quality of life. Frankly, I don't think that's a very strong purpose. I think it's a little vague. I'm not sure exactly what it means. I don't think it addresses basic human needs. I don't find it particularly inspiring. If you have a son and daughter you wanted to bring into the field of planning, and you said, the purpose of planning is, they'd probably go to law school. But I think we had ambitious goals in the past. At the beginning of the last century, we took on urban ills. Suburban development, something we criticize a lot these days, guided by comprehensive planning and regulated by Euclidean zoning, was actually an effective public health and safety measure for about 50 or 60 years. So I think that public health and safety is an important part of our past that we have to reclaim. And the second piece, I believe, is addressing basic needs. The survey that APA had commissioned last March found that people think planning is a pretty good thing. A lot of popular support for it. But they expect planners to address basic human needs like jobs and education. And Paul, in his perspectives piece in the August-September issue, I believe, told us, it's a good time to do economic development planning and focus on building assets. So what if we put these ideas together? What about this? I'm not sure repurpose is a word, but my colleagues thought it was good enough to use. So repurpose planning, but here's the thing. City and regional planning improves public health and builds public wealth. I think that's a little bit more inspirational. It certainly is clearer, and it addresses basic human needs. And I hate to pick on this, but I've been hating it for so many years. So here's a revision in our marketing slogan: making communities safer, healthier, and wealthier. Now, I actually think that APA has done a great job dealing with public health and safety. And what I mean by that is I believe that the work that's gone on in the area of sustainability is addressing that. Here is a slide from Sustaining Places, the role of the comprehensive plan, written by my colleague David Gottschalk and Bill Anderson, who I met earlier, came out of a very intense effort over a couple of years, and it's a document that's filled with great best practice advice, examples, and metrics about measuring progress. I happen to bring a copy in case anybody just wants to peruse it. So I'll argue here that in terms of this first part, this first purpose, that sustainability at the community level, to me, very much translates to health and safety at the individual level. And so in the remaining 20 or 30 minutes, I want to focus on that other piece. That other piece being building public wealth. When I think about sustainability in the economic sphere, that's, to me, what economic development is. So if you want to build public wealth, pursue economic development. And if you want to know how well you're doing, use financial metrics to keep track. I'll talk first about economic development and then about financial metrics. Well, we get into a problem here. Most people confuse economic development with economic growth. Economic development is not the same as economic growth. More jobs and higher tax base, as desirable as they may be, are not metrics of economic development. Here I've tried to contrast them. I think economic growth on the right column are terms that you'll be familiar with. Bigger GDP, external investments, exploitive resource use, more jobs and tax base. Jobs and tax base are economic growth metrics. But economic development is about changing structure so that industries, firms, even urban areas become better places. There's improvement. And these improvements are internally based, not externally imposed. We have sustainable resource use. And higher per capita income and less poverty become metrics of economic development. So I think you can see these differences are very significant. But having said that, they're also complementary and mutually reinforcing. places that are trying to develop are better able to do so if they're able to build on the resources, draw from the resources that growth generates. And places that want to grow are usually more successful if there's a strong kind of base of economic development. And both growth and development generates, obviously, the resources that pay for the public services and facilities that we as planners are very concerned about. So here's the hard part. I think to foster growth and development, planners and their allies have to work with economic developers and growth advocates. They need to find ways to cooperate. Cooperate. I'm not saying who's the planner and who's the economic developer, but the point is cooperate. And I don't underestimate how difficult this is. We are in an environment where local competition is what's emphasized rather than regional cooperation. But we really just need to work together. And this is made harder because economic developers who I've worked with for many, many years, and planners, I could say the same, they're very different. They're very different. They have very different orientations. But I would hope that through difference, there might be synergy. Through difference, there might be creativity. Maybe working with people who don't think like us could help us get to places that we're not able to get working alone. Developers tend to imitate the competition. I think one of the interesting things about bringing planning, is that planners understand the uniqueness of place, and I think we're in a better position to be innovative because of that. There isn't really a silver bullet or one size fits all. So if planners understand the uniqueness of place, I think these unique attributes can come through and inform the economic development strategy. And one of the reasons it's so important for developers and planners to work together is that we really have to do this at a regional level. Regional planning has been an idea that's been in planning, as you know, from the outset. But yet, it's very difficult to do when we have, obviously, government organized in ways that divide up the geography in jurisdictional terms. But this is just not some kind of concept that says regional is good. The fact of the matter is that regional economies, metro areas, are functional economic areas, labor market areas. They're places where what industries make and what people do come together. These labor market areas are, in fact, the basic unit that's competing in the global economy. Whether they're counties, states, national boundaries, it's these functional units. And they're competing for investment, they're competing for talent, they're competing for markets. And we could spend the next hour talking about this topic alone. And the book that Paul was kind enough to cite is really all about this. But really what I want to focus on tonight is how can we take some economic development strategies that we are able to identify at the regional level, figure out what to do at the regional level, and then come down to the local level and figure out how to do these things and where to do them. And I think if we do that, we could have a wonderful outcome of having jurisdictions in a metro area actually working together, knowing why they're doing what they're doing, knowing how their work relates to work going on in other jurisdictions. I'm not saying create regional government. I'm just saying do the coordination that's necessary to get local jurisdictions working together. And when I say this, I know it sounds a bit Pollyannish because I know how hard this is to do, given the realities we all face. Now, planners have fashioned local economic development policies and have included economic elements in community plans. But I think what I'm talking about here, call it cooperative, coordinated regional planning, bringing together economic developers and planners. It would be very unusual, but I think it would also be very powerful. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about how we might do this, planners might do this, at a local level, primarily through the sort of lens of comprehensive planning. As you know, comprehensive plans have certain elements that are related to economic development, things like land use, mobility, housing, community infrastructure, redevelopment, energy efficiency. But I'm just going to throw out some ideas fully recognizing that because of what I've already said about the uniqueness of place, some of these things will not work in some places. And also, in trying to prepare, this was really, to be honest, the hardest part of this talk to figure out what would be worth your time to hear. And it's because I think we know a lot more about accommodating growth than we know about promoting economic development in the terms that I've presented it tonight. So let's use economic-based theory, which most of you, even if you're not an economist, have some familiarity with, that makes a distinction between export or basic sectors that sell goods and services outside the locality and local sectors which sell inside, which I'll talk about in a minute. The basic idea here is that we should support growth and development of basic sectors. Most manufacturing is in the basic sector, both traditional and advanced manufacturing. But in the knowledge economy, obviously, a lot of export industries include services, IT, professional services, health, education, research and development, and so on. In many places, these sectors, these service sectors, are the institutional anchors that spawn innovation. So we have to learn more about how to help basic industries become more competitive. And I think our natural orientation, being spatial, being physical, would be to focus on land use, space use, proximity, those kinds of geographic concepts. I suggest that treating areas that serve basic industries like prime agricultural land or critical watersheds that are worth protecting. The local sector I take a very different approach to. I think here we need to do market research that forecasts commercial space needs so that we can guard against oversupply. This approach may limit competition, but I think it's far worse to squander scarce and expensive public infrastructure on projects that are not needed, may not succeed, or increase failures among existing businesses. There's no need to generate unnecessary competition for local markets that are really, by definition, limited. To accommodate future demand, I would advocate redevelopment rather than new development. Hopefully that idea doesn't have to be discussed a lot here. I think most of us support it. The reasons are fairly obvious. It can be compact or increase compactness. It can support the efficient delivery of public services. It can lower infrastructure costs. It can afford fewer and shorter automobile trips. And also, if you have functional buildings that can be upgraded, that can be reused, this is actually the most energy efficient way to increase space rather than building something new, no matter how green it is. Downtown revitalization, I think, is particularly important because improvement of civic facilities along with private redevelopment enlivens the public realm and helps build social capital. Well-designed mixed-use projects can help revitalize downtown, but urban design proposals often include far too many bars, restaurants, coffee shops. I think you're familiar with this. If you look at the number of bars, restaurants, and coffee shops that might be part of enlivening a block, you wouldn't want to have to visit each one each day. You'd probably become inebriated, obese, and never sleep again. So we really need solutions to bring activity to the streets, which is so important to get the kind of downtowns we want, but without requiring retail space behind every facade. I particularly like this last point because sometimes planners are accused of wanting to make everything pretty. I come from Paterson, New Jersey. It's not a pretty place. Older, cheap commercial space has great value. It's a place where budding entrepreneurs who have big dreams and need cheap space can find a home. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to be more in tune with that whole sector to try to promote entrepreneurship in our communities. So that's what I have on economic development. And now I want to spend the last part talking about financial metrics at the regional, local, project, small area levels. So here's something. This is a measure of wealth in Guilford County, North Carolina. There are methods, there are data to do this. A very reputable World Bank study conducted around the year 2000 did this for 130, applied this methodology to 130 countries around the world. I happened to do a dissertation on this topic 100 years ago. The total wealth in Greensboro, or in Guilford County in 2000, $231 billion, about $550,000 per capita. Human capital was 2/3 of that amount, essentially the present value of future earnings. Maybe some way to help us connect education to the value that it creates. Public land and public capital as a part of total capital was 30%. So if someone claims that governments can't create anything of value, you can use this slide. And finally, one of the interesting things about the methodology is that total wealth is estimated by capitalizing income, which kind of represents the value of the whole. And then when you add up the components of wealth, you get the sum of the parts. So if you believe that the going concern might be different from the pieces of it, then there might be some intangible social assets that represent this difference. And I would propose that we might consider this a way of measuring social capital. Turns out to be almost 12% of the total. So let's move on to the jurisdiction level, the local level. How about a balance sheet for your jurisdiction? A public balance sheet, public sector balance sheet. Everything the public sector owns is an asset. That includes current assets, equipment, as you can see, land, rights of way, etc. But it owes short-term and long-term debt, revenue bonds, geo bonds, and the difference between total assets and total liabilities, which hopefully is a positive difference, is net worth or equity. So imagine delivering your annual report to council on public wealth and how assets, liabilities, and net worth have changed in the past year. Do you think that meeting would be well attended? So let's move on to the project and small area level. The common tool that's out there that consultants use is fiscal impact analysis applied at the project level. But the point I want to make, and it's not an original point, is that we should measure development project impacts on a per acre of land basis. And I attribute that work to Joe Minicosi, who has been making this point and is now spreading the idea around the country. we can compare financial costs and revenues more accurately on a per acre basis than with fiscal impact analysis on a project basis. Joe sent me some data that I'll show to you in a minute on 2 projects. One was a suburban, happened to be a Walmart, not picking on Walmart, happened to be a Walmart. And the second was a downtown infill project, mixed-use project. And here's a pretty busy slide, but I'll try to spend a few minutes going through it. The suburban Walmart used up 34 acres. The downtown mixed-use, 0.2. That's a difference of 170. 170 times more land. So this is like the big suburban, and this is like the little Prius. And property taxes, jobs, there were no residents there. It wasn't a mixed-use project. The property taxes and jobs are quite a bit more on a project basis than those metrics for the downtown mixed-use project. But when we do it on a per-acre basis, that Walmart is paying $6,500 an acre. That downtown mixed-use project is paying 100 times more. 100 times more, almost. $634,000 per acre. 73 jobs as opposed to 6 per acre. And infinitely more residents, because when you divide by 0, you get infinity, right? So this is a way of thinking about it, because the scarce resource that you all have at the jurisdictional level is land. And when you use it, as we know, it's usually in that use for quite a long time. So this is an important way to kind of get the metrics straight at the project level. And finally, at the small area planning level, I could talk a lot more about this. It was too, I would rather respond to questions about it, because when I got in to try to explain it, it just took too long. But basically, a lot of jurisdictions are getting into return on investment analysis. There was a very good presentation at the North Carolina chapter in September that Mitch Silver and his staff did, that talked about a small area plan where they had done return on investment analysis. My point is that in addition to return on investment, we always have to look at the risk side. And I think that more attention needs to be paid to this. I was writing a book for Planners Press with Dave Gottschalk on financial analysis for planners and designers. And on the basis of the presentation that Mitch and his staff gave at the planning conference, we added a part of a chapter because I really thought it was important. We were talking all about project level financial analysis, and we had to step it up and talk some about small area plans, comprehensive plans, and basically we worked out a methodology that I think is quite straightforward and useful in assessing both return and risk in these kinds of infrastructure analyses. So I'm going to stop there and just go back to these big ideas. Here are the 3 things I've said tonight. You can decide how big they are. The purpose of city and regional planning is to improve public health and build public wealth. Planners should be the stewards of public wealth. Planners should take a cooperative, regional, coordinated approach to economic development and use local comprehensive plans to implement regional strategies. Finally, planners should use proper financial metrics to measure wealth and the risk and return on public investments. Thank you.